The wind howled across the frozen wasteland like a wounded animal crying into the night. Officer Daniel Cooper pulled his thermal jacket tighter around his body as he trudged through knee-deep snow. Beside him, his German Shepherd partner Atlas moved with practiced ease, his thick fur protecting him from the brutal Alaskan cold. The year was 2187, and the world had changed in ways that people from centuries past could never have imagined. Humanity had reached for the stars and found that they were not alone. First contact with alien species had happened 3 years ago, and since then, Earth had scrambled to establish its place among the galactic community. Not all of those meetings had been friendly. Some species saw humans as weak, primitive creatures ripe for exploitation. Others saw them as a threat to be eliminated before they could grow too strong. Daniel had been assigned to patrol the remote sensor stations along Earth's northern defense perimeter. These stations monitored space for incoming threats and maintained a constant watch over the skies. It was lonely work, cold and dangerous, but someone had to do it. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and out here a man had only his training, his equipment, and his partner to rely on. Atlas had been with Daniel for 3 years now, and the bond between them went deeper than simple companionship. The dog had saved his life twice, and Daniel had returned the favor once. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words. The sun was setting behind heavy clouds, casting the landscape in shades of gray and blue. Daniel checked his wrist scanner and noted that Sensor Station 7 was still 2 miles ahead. The station should be operating normally, sending automated reports every 6 hours, but something about today felt wrong. Daniel could not explain it, just a feeling in his gut that had served him well over the years. Atlas seemed to sense it too. The dog's ears were up, alert, and his nose worked constantly, testing the air for scents that Daniel's human senses could never detect. They had covered another half-mile when Atlas suddenly stopped. The dog's body went rigid, and he turned his head sharply to the left, staring at a section of unmarked snow that looked no different from any other part of the frozen plain. Daniel halted immediately and knelt beside his partner, placing a gloved hand on the dog's shoulders. Atlas whined softly, a sound he only made when he found something important. Daniel trusted that instinct completely. He pulled out his portable scanner and swept it across the area where Atlas was focused. At first, nothing appeared on the readout except the normal geological signatures of rock and ice beneath the snow. Then, as he adjusted the frequency range, something pinged on the screen. It was faint, barely registering, but it was there, an energy signature that should not exist in this empty wilderness. Daniel adjusted the scanner again, switching to deep penetration mode. The reading became clearer. 15 feet below the surface, something was emitting a low-power distress beacon. The frequency was not human, not anything in Earth's military database. Daniel's training told him to call this in immediately and wait for backup. Unknown alien technology required specialized teams and proper protocols. But something about the signal bothered him. It was weak and getting weaker, like a dying heartbeat fading into nothing. Whatever was down there might not survive the 3 or 4 hours it would take for backup to arrive. He looked at Atlas, and the dog looked back at him with those intelligent brown eyes. The decision was not really a decision at all. Daniel activated his comm unit and logged his position, noting the anomalous reading and his intention to investigate. At least there would be a record if something went wrong. Then he unslung the collapsible shovel from his pack and began to dig. The work was hard and slow. The snow was dense and packed, compressed by its own weight and the constant wind. Daniel dug methodically, creating a wide shaft that would not collapse on him as he went deeper. Atlas helped as dogs do, using his powerful legs to push snow aside, though Daniel had to stop him several times to keep the dog from exhausting himself. An hour passed, then 2. The temperature continued to drop as night fell completely, and Daniel had to switch on his helmet light to see what he was doing. The shaft was now 10 feet deep, and his scanner showed he was getting close to the source of the signal. Sweat soaked his underlayers despite the cold, and his arms ached from the repetitive motion of shoveling. But he kept going, driven by that feeling that something important waited below. At 12 feet down, his shovel struck something that was not ice. The metallic ring echoed in the confined space of the shaft. Daniel carefully cleared away the remaining snow, revealing a smooth surface of silver-blue metal. The material was unlike anything he had seen before, Neither steel nor titanium nor any of the common alloys used in human construction. His scanner confirmed it. This was an unknown element, or more likely, an alloy created by a technology more advanced than Earth's. Daniel brushed away more snow, following the curve of the metal, and his light revealed what appeared to be a viewport. He cleared the transparent surface and shone his light through it. What he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat. A figure lay motionless within, humanoid but clearly not human. The being was tall, far taller than any person Daniel had ever met, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer slightly in the light. White hair, long and tangled, framed a face that was both beautiful and alien. The being wore what looked like a military uniform, dark fabric torn in several places and stained with something that might have been blood, though it was a strange blue color. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. This was a spacecraft, or more precisely, an escape pod. It had crashed here, burying itself deep in the snow, and the occupant had been trapped inside ever since. The question was how long? Days, weeks? And more importantly, was the being still alive? His scanner gave him the answer he both hoped for and feared. There were life signs, faint but present, though they were declining rapidly. The pod's power systems were failing, and with them, the life support that kept the occupant alive. Daniel knew what he had to do, even as his training screamed at him to stop and think. This could be an enemy, one of the hostile species that had attacked human colonies. The uniform suggested military, which meant this was a soldier, possibly someone who had killed humans. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that a living being was dying in front of him, and Daniel had the power to help. Daniel worked quickly now, his movements precise despite the cramped conditions in the shaft he had dug. The escape pod was partially embedded in frozen earth beneath the snow, tilted at an angle that suggested it had hit the ground with tremendous force. Scorch marks along the hull indicated it had survived atmospheric entry, though just barely. He ran his gloved hands along the surface, searching for an access panel or emergency release. Atlas watched from above, occasionally barking to remind Daniel that he was still there. The pod's design was elegant in its simplicity, all smooth curves and seamless joints that spoke of a manufacturing process far beyond current human capabilities. Daniel found what he was looking for near what he assumed was the rear of the craft. A panel with symbols he could not read. But the universal language of emergency systems was clear enough. Red markings, a handle that could only be pulled one way, and a warning symbol that needed no translation. He grabbed the handle and pulled hard. Nothing happened. He tried again, putting his full weight into it, and this time felt something give. There was a hiss of escaping air, stale and oddly sweet-smelling, and the hatch began to open. The interior of the pod was cramped, designed for a single occupant during emergency situations. The being inside was strapped into an acceleration couch, restraints cutting into the torn uniform. Up close, Daniel could see details that his light had not revealed through the viewport. The alien's skin was not just blue, but had an almost crystalline quality to it, like frost on a window. The white hair was actually more silver, catching the light in strange ways. And the face, despite its alien features, showed an expression Daniel recognized. Pain and exhaustion, the look of someone who had been through hell and barely survived. Daniel checked for a pulse, though he had no idea where to check on this species. He tried the neck first, as that seemed universal among humanoid creatures, and felt something fluttering beneath the cold skin. The heartbeat was there, but irregular and far too slow. The being was dying, hypothermia taking its toll even on a physiology adapted for different conditions. Daniel worked to release the restraints, his fingers clumsy in the heavy gloves. When the last strap came free, the alien slumped forward, and Daniel caught the weight with a grunt of effort. The being was heavy, easily over 200 pounds despite appearing lean. Getting the alien out of the pod and up the shaft was the hardest physical challenge Daniel had faced in years. He could not simply drag the body through the snow, as that would cause more damage to someone already critically injured. Instead, he rigged a makeshift harness using climbing rope from his pack and his own equipment straps. Atlas helped by grabbing the rope in his teeth and pulling when Daniel gave the command, adding his strength to the effort. Inch by inch, they hauled the unconscious alien up through the shaft until finally, mercifully, they reached the surface. Daniel laid the being on a thermal blanket and quickly wrapped it around the cold body. His medical training was basic, designed for human injuries, but some things were universal. Stop the bleeding, maintain body temperature, keep the airway clear. The alien had several wounds that were still seeping that blue blood, soaking through the torn uniform. Daniel applied pressure bandages as best he could, working by the light of his helmet. The bleeding slowed but did not stop completely. He needed real medical help, and he needed it fast. The comm unit crackled to life as Daniel activated the emergency channel. His voice was steady despite the situation, years of training keeping panic at bay. He identified himself, gave his coordinates, and reported finding a critically injured survivor of what appeared to be a spacecraft crash. He did not mention that the survivor was not human. That detail could wait until the response team arrived. What mattered was getting help here as quickly as possible. The response was immediate. A medical evacuation team was being scrambled, estimated arrival time 30 minutes. Daniel was ordered to maintain the survivor's condition and await extraction. He acknowledged the orders and turned his attention back to his patient. The alien's eyes were moving beneath closed lids, a sign of consciousness trying to return. Daniel spoke softly, using the calm tone he employed with Atlas when the dog was stressed. It did not matter that the being could not understand his words. Tone carried meaning beyond language. Atlas lay down beside the wrapped form, lending his body heat to the effort to warm the alien. The dog showed no fear or aggression, only the concern of a creature that understood suffering when it saw it. Daniel had always believed that dogs were better judges of character than most humans, and Atlas's acceptance of the stranger meant something. He ran his scanner over the alien's body, gathering data that the medical team would need. The readout showed internal injuries, broken bones, and signs of severe trauma consistent with a high-speed crash. Then something on the scanner caught his attention. A foreign object embedded near the base of the skull, too regular in shape to be shrapnel or broken bone. It showed up as a dense mass of circuitry and data storage, clearly artificial and clearly intentional. Some kind of implant, military grade if Daniel was any judge. The implications were troubling. Implants like that were used for secure communications, data storage, or identity verification. This was not a civilian caught in the wrong place. This was a soldier, possibly an officer given the quality of the uniform. Daniel's mind wrestled with the implications. Earth was not officially at war with any alien species, but there had been incidents, raids on colony worlds, attacks on merchant vessels, skirmishes along disputed borders. One species in particular, the Velcrin Empire, had been responsible for most of the aggression. They were expansionist and militant, viewing other species as either servants or obstacles. Human intelligence had confirmed that Velcrin military forces were conducting operations in nearby star systems. If this was a Velcrin soldier, then the situation had just become far more complicated. The alien's eyes opened suddenly, startling Daniel. They were large and luminous, with vertical pupils that contracted sharply in the light from his helmet. The color was a deep violet, almost purple, and filled with confusion and fear. The being tried to speak, and blood bubbled from its lips. The sound was harsh and guttural, nothing like any human language, but Daniel's universal translator picked up fragments. The device was new technology, still imperfect, but it caught one word clearly: please. The alien was begging. Whether for help or mercy or something else, Daniel could not tell. He pulled off his glove and placed his bare hand on the alien's forehead, ignoring the shocking cold of that crystalline skin. His touch was gentle, meant to reassure. The alien's eyes focused on him, really seeing him for the first time, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. One being looking at another and seeing not an enemy or an alien, but simply someone who was suffering and in need. The moment stretched, and then the alien's eyes closed again, consciousness fading back into darkness. The sound of engines broke the silence of the frozen night. Daniel looked up to see lights approaching fast, the distinctive profile of a military VTOL aircraft coming in for landing. The medical team had made good time, probably pushing their engines beyond safe limits to get here. The aircraft touched down 50 yards away, snow billowing up in great clouds from the rotor wash. The side door slid open and figures in cold weather gear jumped out, carrying equipment cases. The medical team reached Daniel's position within seconds, their movements efficient and professional. The team leader was a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an air of authority that came from years of emergency medicine. Her name tag read Martinez, and she took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. Her expression changed from focused determination to shock when she saw what lay wrapped in the thermal blanket. She dropped to her knees beside the alien and began her assessment without hesitation, though Daniel could see the questions in her eyes. Dr. Lisa Martinez had seen many things in her career as a military physician. She had treated soldiers wounded in combat, civilians caught in crossfire, and victims of accidents both mundane and bizarre. But she had never treated an alien before, and certainly not a Velcrin. She recognized the species from intelligence briefings, from the distinctive blue skin and the silver hair that marked them as clearly as any uniform. This was a member of the species that had killed human colonists, that had attacked merchant ships and left no survivors. Yet here it was, dying in the snow, and her oath as a doctor left her no choice but to try to save it. She worked quickly, snapping orders to her team. They set up portable medical equipment, scanners adapted from human models but programmed with xenobiology data from the limited contact humanity had with alien species. The readings were not good. The Velcrin's core temperature was dangerously low, even accounting for the species' natural tolerance for cold. Multiple internal injuries showed on the scans, including a collapsed lung equivalent and severe trauma to organs that Martinez could only guess the function of. The patient needed surgery, needed it soon, and needed it in a proper medical facility with equipment designed for Velcrin physiology. Daniel watched as they loaded the alien onto a stretcher and secured it for transport. Atlas stayed close to his side, the dog's attention fixed on the medical team's movements. Martinez approached Daniel, her expression serious. She asked him to explain exactly what happened, how he found the crash site, and what condition the alien was in when he first opened the pod. Daniel gave her the facts clearly and concisely, leaving out his own doubts and concerns. Those could wait for later. What mattered now was giving the doctor the information she needed to save her patient's life. The flight to the military medical facility took 25 minutes, and Daniel insisted on going with them. Martinez did not argue, perhaps recognizing that Daniel had already crossed several lines by rescuing an enemy combatant, and keeping him close was better than letting him wander off with knowledge of the situation. Atlas came too, settling onto the floor of the aircraft beside Daniel's seat and watching everything with alert intelligence. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, something that went beyond their normal duties. During the flight, the Velcrin's vital signs crashed. The monitors began screaming alarms, and Martinez shouted orders as her team scrambled to respond. Daniel found himself gripping his seat, watching helplessly as they fought to keep the alien alive. They injected medications that were best guesses based on limited data, adjusted the oxygen mixture flowing into the patient's breathing mask, and manually compressed the chest when the heart stopped beating. For 3 terrible minutes, Daniel thought they were going to lose the patient, and he was surprised by how much that bothered him. He should not care. This was potentially an enemy, someone who might have human blood on their hands. Yet he did care deeply and irrationally. The heart started again, weak but steady. Martinez slumped back, her face pale beneath her professional mask. She looked at Daniel and shook her head slightly, a gesture that said this was far from over. They still might lose the patient, and even if they did not, the questions about what to do with a Velcrin soldier on Earth soil were going to be difficult ones. Daniel understood that, but he also understood that those were problems for people above his pay grade. His job had been to find someone who needed help and get them that help. Everything after that was someone else's responsibility. They landed at the medical facility, a sprawling complex of buildings built into the side of a mountain. It served as both a hospital for military personnel and a research center for xenobiology, the study of alien life forms. The Velcrin patient was rushed into an operating theater while Daniel was escorted to a waiting area and told to stay put. A guard was posted at the door, polite but firm. Daniel was not under arrest, not exactly, but he was not free to leave either. He sat in an uncomfortable chair with Atlas at his feet and waited for someone to come and ask him the hard questions. Commander Joseph Blake arrived 2 hours later. He was a career military officer, a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many battles. He sat across from Daniel and studied him for a long moment before speaking. His voice was controlled but carried an edge of anger. He wanted to know why Daniel had saved a Velcrin soldier, why he had risked exposing their defensive positions to a potential enemy scout. and why he had not followed protocol and waited for backup before taking any action. Daniel met the commander's gaze steadily and gave his answer. He had found a person in critical condition and used his judgment to provide emergency assistance. The fact that the person was not human did not change his duty as an officer and as a human being. He had made a choice in the moment, and he would make the same choice again. Blake listened without interrupting, and when Daniel finished, the commander was silent for a long time. Then he stood and told Daniel he was confined to quarters pending a full investigation. The alien's survival or death would determine what happened next. 3 days passed. Daniel spent them in a small room in the facility's temporary housing section. He was allowed to shower, eat in the cafeteria under escort, and exercise Atlas in a secure yard. But he was not allowed to contact anyone outside the facility or access any communications equipment. He was in limbo, waiting for a decision about his fate. The isolation gave him too much time to think, to question his choices, to wonder if he had destroyed his career for a being that might not even survive. On the third night, Martinez came to see him. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from days of constant work. She told him that the Velcrin patient had survived the surgery and was awake. Against all odds and medical expectations, the alien was going to live. But something else had happened. Something that changed the entire situation. During the medical procedures, they had discovered the implant in the patient's skull. When they tried to analyze it, the implant had activated a security protocol. It transmitted a message, brief and encrypted, that contained what appeared to be military intelligence data. Martinez explained that the intelligence teams had been working around the clock to decrypt the message. They had finally succeeded that morning, and what they found was deeply disturbing. The Velcrin patient was not a combat pilot or a scout. His name was Lieutenant Cale Vorn, and he had been a junior officer in the Velcrin Military Research Division. He had not crashed by accident. He had fled, stealing an escape pod and launching himself toward Earth space while being pursued by his own military forces. His pod had been hit by weapons fire during the escape, which explained the damage and the rough landing. The reason for his flight, the reason he had risked everything to reach Earth, was contained in the data chip. He had discovered something terrible about what the Velcrin Empire was planning. The details were still being analyzed, but the preliminary report suggested a weapon development program, something designed specifically to target human populations. Cale had tried to report it through proper channels, but instead of investigating his claims, his superiors had tried to silence him permanently. So he ran, and in running he had chosen Earth as his destination, whether that was because he hoped to warn humanity, or simply because it was the closest safe harbor no one yet knew. The emergency medical flight had been the most intense experience of Lisa Martinez's career. She had worked in war zones and disaster areas, and in every kind of crisis situation imaginable, but trying to save the life of an alien whose physiology she barely understood while flying through turbulent weather was something entirely new. Her team had performed admirably, following her orders without question even when those orders were educated guesses at best. The fact that their patient had survived the flight at all was close to miraculous. The military medical facility they landed at was equipped with some of the most advanced technology on Earth, but even that was barely adequate for treating a Velcrin. Lisa had access to a xenobiology database compiled from the limited interactions humanity had with various alien species, but the information on Velcrin physiology was sparse and often contradictory. She had to adapt human medical procedures on the fly, hoping that the similarities between humanoid species were enough to make her treatments effective rather than fatal. The first surgery lasted 14 hours. Lisa worked with a team of specialists, each bringing their expertise to bear on the problem of keeping an alien alive. They had to repair internal damage from the crash, set broken bones that were denser and stronger than human bones, and deal with a circulatory system that operated on principles only partly understood. The patient crashed twice during the procedure, vital signs flattering as the heart equivalent struggled to maintain function. Each time, Lisa's team brought Cale back from the edge, using a combination of human medical knowledge and desperate improvisation. Daniel had refused to leave the waiting area. Despite being told multiple times that the surgery would take many hours and that there was nothing he could do, he stayed. Atlas remained at his side, the dog's presence a comfort in the sterile environment of the medical facility. Lisa would occasionally send updates through a nurse, brief messages letting Daniel know that the patient was still alive, still fighting. She was not sure why she bothered. Daniel was just a patrol officer who had stumbled into something much larger than himself. But something about his dedication, his refusal to abandon the being he had saved, impressed her. When the surgery finally ended, Lisa was too exhausted to feel relief. She gave instructions for post-operative care to her staff and went to find Daniel. He deserved to know that his rescue had not been in vain. She found him asleep in an uncomfortable chair, Atlas curled up at his feet. Both woke instantly when she entered the room, and Daniel's first question was about the patient's condition. Lisa told him that Kale, as they now knew the alien was called, had survived the surgery but remained in critical condition. The next few days would determine whether he recovered or succumbed to complications. Commander Blake arrived shortly after, and the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The commander was furious, though he kept his anger tightly controlled. He demanded to know why Daniel had taken it upon himself to save what was clearly an enemy combatant. Why he had not followed protocols that existed for exactly this kind of situation. Daniel's explanation that he had found a dying person and acted to save them did not satisfy the commander. Blake pointed out that Daniel's actions had potentially compromised security, revealed the location of defensive installations, and created a diplomatic nightmare. The argument was interrupted by an alert from the medical bay. Kale's vital signs were dropping again. Lisa ran back to her patient, Daniel and Blake following, despite the security protocols that should have kept them out. What they found was Kale's body rejecting the synthetic blood substitute that Lisa had used during surgery. The Velcrin circulatory system was more complex than the database had indicated, and the human-made substitute was causing a toxic reaction. Kale was dying again, and this time Lisa had no solution ready. She made a desperate decision. If synthetic blood would not work, perhaps natural Velcrin blood would. But they had no supply of that, no way to obtain it. And no way to know if Kale's blood type would even be compatible with a transfusion from another Velcrin. Unless... Lisa turned to look at the readouts from Kale's medical scans, searching for something she had noticed earlier. There, in the chemical analysis of his blood, a marker that suggested Kale had what in humans would be called a universal donor type. If that held true for Velcrin biology, and if they could synthesize a close enough approximation based on his own blood chemistry, they might have a chance. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Lisa's team worked to create a synthetic blood that matched Kyle's own chemistry, using samples taken during surgery and running countless tests to ensure it would not cause further harm. They had to get it right on the first try, because there would not be time for a second attempt. When the new blood substitute was ready, Lisa administered it herself, watching the monitors with an intensity that made her vision blur. For long minutes, nothing changed. Then slowly, Kale's vital signs began to stabilize. The crisis had passed. Daniel had watched the entire procedure from the observation window, unable to help but unable to look away. When it became clear that Kale would survive, he felt something release in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. Blake stood beside him, silent now, his anger transformed into something more complex. The commander's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, asking Daniel why this mattered so much to him. Daniel's answer was simple. Life mattered, all life, and the moment you started deciding which lives were worth saving and which were not, you lost something essential about what it meant to be human. The discovery of the implant came later, during routine scans to monitor Kale's recovery. Lisa had noticed the unusual density near the base of his skull and ordered more detailed imaging. What they found was a piece of technology far more advanced than anything in the human arsenal. A data storage device integrated directly with Kale's neural pathways, encrypted and protected by security measures that would destroy the data if anyone tried to remove it forcibly. The implications were immediately clear to everyone present. This was military intelligence, and Kale was either a spy or a defector. Commander Blake ordered the facility locked down. No one entered or left without his direct authorization. A team of intelligence specialists was brought in to analyze the implant and attempt to access its data. They quickly determined that the encryption was beyond their ability to crack without Kyle's cooperation. The data chip would only unlock if Kale himself provided the access codes, and any attempt to bypass that security would result in the data being permanently erased. They would have to wait until Cale regained consciousness and then convince him to share whatever secrets he had fled with. Meanwhile, Lisa continued to monitor her patient's recovery. Cale had survived the surgery and the subsequent crisis, but his body had been through tremendous trauma. He remained unconscious, his brain activity showing the patterns of deep sleep rather than coma. His body was healing itself with a speed that surprised Lisa. The Velcrin apparently had a robust regenerative capability, something the database had mentioned but underestimated. Broken bones were already beginning to knit back together, and internal injuries showed signs of repair that would have taken weeks in a human patient. On the third day after surgery, Cale's eyes opened. Lisa was at his bedside running routine checks when it happened. One moment he was unconscious, and the next, those violet eyes were staring at her with an intensity that was almost frightening. She spoke softly, telling him where he was and that he was safe. The translator device picked up her words and converted them into Velcrin, a harsh and musical language that sounded strange coming from the small speaker. Cale's response was immediate and violent. Calvorn woke to pain and confusion. His body felt wrong, heavy and weak in ways that terrified him. The last thing he remembered clearly was the escape pod shaking apart around him as he hit the atmosphere, the controls dead in his hands, and the terrible certainty that he was going to die far from home. Now he was somewhere else, somewhere with bright lights and strange smells, and there were creatures around him that looked almost Velcrin but were not. Humans. He was surrounded by humans, and his training told him they were the enemy, even as his fractured memories whispered that something had changed. He tried to sit up and found himself restrained. Panic flooded through him, and he pulled against the bonds holding him to the bed. His body responded sluggishly, weak from injury and surgery, but fear gave him strength. He heard himself making sounds, words in his own language demanding to know where he was and what they had done to him. A human female stood nearby, small and fragile-looking compared to a Velcrin warrior, but her eyes were calm, and she showed no fear. She spoke in her strange, soft language, and a device translated her words into something he could understand. She was telling him he was safe, that they had saved his life, that he was in a medical facility. Cale did not believe her. How could he? Humans were supposed to be barbaric, violent creatures who knew nothing of honor or mercy. That was what he had been taught his entire life. They were the enemy, the threat that the Velcrin Empire existed to contain and ultimately eliminate. Yet here he was, alive when he should be dead, and this human was telling him they had performed surgery to save him. It made no sense, and things that made no sense were dangerous. He needed to escape, needed to get away before they started the interrogation and torture that must surely be coming. The door to the medical bay opened, and Cale's attention snapped to the new arrival. A human male entered, shorter than Cale but built solid and strong. He wore what looked like a uniform, though not the military style Cale had seen in intelligence briefings. Behind him came something that made Cale freeze. A predator, four-legged and covered in fur, with teeth designed for killing. The creature was some kind of canine, similar to hunting beasts the Velcrin used but smaller. It should have been threatening, should have made Cale's combat instincts surge. Instead, the animal walked calmly to the side of the human male and sat, its attention on Cale but its posture relaxed. Daniel had been notified the moment Cale regained consciousness. He came immediately, despite Commander Blake's orders to let the intelligence teams handle the initial contact. Daniel felt responsible for the Velcrin in a way he could not fully explain. He had pulled Kyle from the snow, had watched him nearly die multiple times, and now he wanted to see this through. Atlas came with him because the dog went everywhere with him, and because Daniel trusted Atlas's instincts about people more than he trusted official protocols. The scene in the medical bay was tense. Cale was pulling against his restraints, his violet eyes wild with fear and anger. Lisa stood at a safe distance, ready to sedate the patient if necessary, but clearly hoping to avoid it. Daniel approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. He spoke in a low, steady voice, the same tone he used to calm frightened civilians or spooked horses. The translator picked up his words and converted them. though Daniel suspected his tone carried more meaning than the actual words. He told Cale that no one was going to hurt him, that he had been injured in a crash and they had provided medical care, that he was on Earth in a military facility, but he was being treated as a patient, not a prisoner. At least not yet, though Daniel did not say that part. He watched Cale's eyes track his movements, saw the intelligence working behind the fear. This was not some mindless soldier. This was someone smart enough to be dangerous and scared enough to be unpredictable. Atlas made the decision for both of them. The dog stood and walked calmly toward the bed where Cale lay restrained. Daniel almost called him back, but stopped himself. Atlas had good instincts about these things. The dog approached to within a few feet of the bed and sat again, his tail wagging slowly. He made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but something similar, a noise that dogs made when they were trying to be friendly. Cale stared at the animal, confusion replacing some of the fear in his expression. In Velcrin culture, animals were tools or food, not companions. The concept of keeping a predator as a pet was alien to them. Yet here was this creature, clearly, bonded to the human, showing no aggression toward Cale despite having every reason to see him as a threat. Atlas moved closer and Cale tensed, expecting an attack. Instead, the dog simply settled down on the floor beside the bed, close enough that Cale could have reached out and touched him if his hands were free. The dog's presence was calming in a way Cale did not understand. Daniel saw the change in Cale's body language, the way the violent tension began to ease. He took another step closer and continued talking. He introduced himself by name, then gestured to Atlas and did the same for the dog. He explained that he was the one who had found Cale buried in the snow, that he had called for medical help, and that the doctors had worked for many hours to save his life. He did not mention that Cale was technically an enemy combatant, that there were serious questions about what to do with him, or that the data chip in his skull had already been discovered. Cale listened to the translated words and tried to reconcile them with everything he knew about humans. They were supposed to be cruel and primitive, yet they had saved his life. This human, Daniel, had apparently found him and chosen to help rather than kill or capture. It did not fit with what Cale had been taught, and that dissonance was almost as disturbing as the situation itself. He tested the restraints again, more gently this time, and the human female, the doctor, spoke through the translator. She said they would remove the restraints if he promised not to try to escape or hurt anyone. She said it was for his own safety, as much as theirs, because his injuries were still healing. Cale made that promise, though he was not sure he would keep it. The restraints were removed and he slowly sat up, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. He looked down at himself and saw bandages covering much of his torso, places where the surgery had been performed. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple medical gown. He felt vulnerable and weak, feelings no Velcrin warrior was supposed to experience. Daniel offered him water, and after a moment's hesitation, Cale accepted. The container was designed for human hands, awkward for his larger fingers, but he managed to drink. The water was cold and clean, and it helped clear some of the fog from his mind. Commander Blake chose that moment to enter the medical bay, flanked by armed guards. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Kyle saw the weapons and the hostile expressions, and his body tensed for a fight he knew he could not win. Daniel stepped between Cale and the commander, a protective gesture that surprised everyone, including Daniel himself. Blake's expression hardened, and he ordered Daniel to step aside. This was now a military intelligence matter, and a patrol officer had no business being involved. But Daniel did not move. He said that Cale was still a patient under medical care, and any interrogation would have to wait until Dr. Martinez cleared him. Blake's face reddened with anger, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might turn violent. Then Lisa spoke up, her voice firm and professional. She stated that as the attending physician she was responsible for her patient's welfare, and she would not allow anything that might compromise his recovery. Cale needed rest, needed time to heal, and needed to be approached with respect rather than hostility if they wanted his cooperation. The standoff in the medical bay lasted for several tense seconds before Commander Blake made his decision. He ordered everyone except essential medical staff to leave, and that included Daniel. But he also agreed to give Cale time to recover before beginning any formal questioning. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but prevented the situation from escalating further. Daniel left reluctantly, Atlas at his side, but he glanced back at Cale before the door closed. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Over the following days, Cale's physical recovery progressed faster than anyone expected. Velcrin regenerative abilities were remarkable, and with proper medical care and nutrition, his body healed rapidly. But his mental state was more complicated. He was isolated in the medical bay, with guards outside his door and surveillance monitoring his every move. The humans treated him well enough, providing food and medical care, but he was clearly a prisoner. The only person who visited regularly was Lisa, who came to check on his condition and slowly began to talk with him about things beyond just medical matters. Kyle learned about Earth through those conversations, about human culture and history, about the diversity of their species and their stubborn refusal to give up even when facing impossible odds. Lisa learned about Velcrin society, about a culture built on strict hierarchies and military service, about a people who valued honor and duty above individual desires. They were careful conversations, each of them aware that they represented their entire species to the other, but they were also genuine. Lisa found herself liking Cale despite everything, and Cale began to see humans as more than the monsters his government had portrayed them as. The intelligence teams continued their attempts to access the data chip in Cale's skull. They approached him multiple times, offering everything from freedom to riches in exchange for the access codes. Kyle refused every offer. He said he would only speak with Daniel, the human who had saved his life. The intelligence officers were baffled by this insistence. Daniel was nobody important, just a patrol officer with no authority or influence. But Cale would not be moved. He would share what he knew, he said, but only with the one who had shown him mercy when he had no reason to. Commander Blake was forced to bring Daniel back into the situation. He did so grudgingly, making it clear that Daniel was there only because the prisoner insisted on it. Daniel entered the medical bay with Atlas, finding Cale sitting up in bed, looking stronger than the last time they had met. The Velcrin's eyes tracked Daniel's movement, and when they were alone, except for the ever-present guards outside, Cale spoke through the translator. He thanked Daniel for saving his life, and then he did something that shocked everyone watching through the surveillance cameras. Cale stood, moving with only slight stiffness from his healing injuries, and performed a gesture Daniel had never seen before. He pressed his right palm against Daniel's chest directly over his heart, and then brought that same hand to his own chest. He held it there for a long moment, his eyes locked with Daniel's, and spoke words in his own language that the translator rendered carefully. He was declaring a life debt, a bond recognized in Velcrin culture as sacred and unbreakable. Daniel had saved his life when he could have let him die or taken him prisoner for interrogation. And for that, Kyle owed him everything. Daniel did not fully understand the significance of the gesture, but he felt the weight of it. He accepted simply, saying that he had done what any decent person would do, what any human should do when they find someone in need. That answer seemed to affect Cale deeply. The Velcrin was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. He said that no Velcrin officer would have done the same, that if their positions had been reversed, Daniel would have been left to die or captured for intelligence purposes. The concept of mercy toward an enemy was not part of Velcrin military doctrine. Daniel asked the question that had been bothering him since Cale first woke. Why did Cale flee? What was so important that he stole an escape pod and risked everything to reach Earth? Cale's expression darkened, and he sat back down on the bed as if the weight of what he was about to reveal was too much to bear standing. He told Daniel that he had worked in a research facility, part of the Velcrin military's weapons development program. His specialty was biological weapons, agents designed to target specific species while leaving others unharmed. The project Cale had been assigned to was codenamed Silent Winter. It was a biological agent specifically tailored to human DNA, a weapon that would spread like a plague through human populations while being completely harmless to Velcrin and their allied species. The weapon was in final testing stages, using human prisoners captured from colony raids as test subjects. Cale had seen the results, had watched humans die in agony as the weapon tore their cells apart from the inside. The deaths were not quick or merciful. They were prolonged and horrific. Daniel felt sick as the translator spoke Cale's words. This was genocide, pure and simple, and it was nearly ready for deployment. Cale continued his explanation, saying that he had tried to report his concerns through proper channels. He had gone to his superiors and argued that this weapon violated every principle of honorable warfare, that it was a tool of extermination rather than military victory. His reward for speaking up was to be marked for elimination. He was supposed to die in a lab accident, a convenient way to silence a troublesome officer. Instead, he had learned of the plot, stolen the escape pod, and fled toward the only place he thought might be able to stop what was coming. The data chip in his skull contained everything: complete specifications for the weapon, test results, deployment schedules, and names of every officer involved in the project. It was enough evidence to prove what the Velcrin Empire was planning, and potentially enough to stop it if acted upon quickly. But Cale had designed the encryption himself, paranoid that he might be captured before reaching safety. Only he could unlock the data, and he would only do so if certain conditions were met. Daniel asked what those conditions were, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Cale said he would provide full access to the data chip, would cooperate completely with human authorities, but only if Daniel vouched for him. Cale had no reason to trust humans in general, but he trusted Daniel. More than that, he believed that if Daniel represented what humanity could be, then perhaps his species deserved to survive. Perhaps they were worth betraying his own people to save. Commander Blake, listening to the conversation through the surveillance system, was already making calls to his superiors. This was beyond his authority to handle. The information Cale possessed could change the entire situation with the Velcrin Empire, could prevent a genocidal attack before it happened. But it required trusting a defector whose motives were still unclear. Blake needed authorization from the highest levels of military and civilian government, and he needed it quickly. Daniel sat with Cale and asked him more about the weapon. How long before it was deployed? How many humans would be at risk? What countermeasures might be possible? Cale answered every question thoroughly, though some of the technical details were beyond Daniel's understanding. The timeline was the most alarming part. The weapon was scheduled for deployment within 6 months, targeting the largest human colony worlds first. Millions would die in the initial release, and the disease would spread from there. Within a year, humanity would be reduced to scattered survivors, too few and too dispersed to pose any threat to Velcrin expansion. Atlas, who had been lying quietly beside Daniel's chair, suddenly stood and approached Cale. The dog had been calm throughout the conversation, but now he moved with purpose. He reached the Velcrin and did something that surprised everyone. Atlas placed his head on Cale's knee, a gesture of trust and affection that dogs reserve for people they considered friends. Cale looked down at the animal, confusion and something like wonder crossing his features. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and touched the dog's head. Atlas's tail wagged, and Kyle's expression softened in a way that made him look younger and far less dangerous. Daniel watched this interaction and made his decision. He told Cale that he believed him, that he would vouch for him with the authorities, and that he would do everything in his power to help Cale expose what the Velcrin Empire was planning. But he also told Cale that this was not going to be easy, that there would be people who would never trust him, and that providing this information might make him a traitor to his own species forever. Cale met Daniel's eyes and said something that the translator rendered as both simple and profound. Some betrayals were necessary to remain true to what mattered. The revelation of what Cale knew sent shockwaves through the highest levels of Earth's government and military command. Emergency sessions were convened, bringing together leaders from every major nation and military branch. The threat was existential, the kind of scenario that kept defense planners awake at night. A biological weapon specifically designed to exterminate humanity, already in final testing, and scheduled for deployment within months. The debates were fierce and immediate, with opinions splitting along predictable lines. One faction, led by hardline military commanders, argued for immediate preemptive strikes against known Velcrin military installations. If the enemy was planning genocide, the response should be overwhelming force directed at their capacity to wage war. Destroy the weapons facilities, cripple their fleet, and send a message that humanity would not go quietly into extinction. The tactical plans were already being drawn up, target lists compiled, and strike forces put on alert. It would be a war, possibly a long and bloody one, but it was better than waiting to die. Another group, composed mainly of diplomats and civilian leaders, pushed for bringing the evidence before the Galactic Council. Humanity was still a new member of the galactic community, still trying to establish its place among older and more established species. Surely the Council would not tolerate genocide, would not allow one member species to exterminate another. They could present Kale's data as evidence, demand intervention, and let the weight of galactic law and opinion force the Velcrin to stand down. It was a more civilized approach, one that did not risk starting a war that humanity might not win. Both sides had valid points, and both sides were wrong in their own ways. The Hawks understood the reality of force but underestimated the cost of the war they were proposing. The Doves had faith in institutions that were untested and might not act quickly enough to matter. While they argued, precious time was slipping away. Every day that passed brought the deployment of Silent Winter closer to reality. Something had to be done, and it had to be done soon. But no one could agree on what that something should be. Kyle, still confined to the medical facility but now moved to more comfortable quarters, listened to reports of these debates through Lisa, who had become something like a friend. He was frustrated by the paralysis he saw, by humanity's inability to act decisively in the face of clear threat. In Velcrin society, a threat like this would have been met with immediate military response. But he was also impressed by the fact that humans debated at all, that they considered options beyond simple violence. It was a kind of strength his people had lost somewhere in their history. Then Kyle proposed something that changed the entire conversation. He revealed that he was not alone in his opposition to Silent Winter. There was a faction within the Velcrin military, officers who believed the Empire had lost its way, who saw the biological weapon as an abomination that violated every principle of honorable warfare. They were not numerous, and they were not powerful enough to stop the weapon's deployment on their own. But they existed and they wanted to act. What they lacked was proof, hard evidence that could be presented to the Velcrin High Command and used to force a reckoning. The problem was that Kale's data chip, while containing detailed information about Silent Winter, did not have everything. He had fled before he could gather the complete documentation, the final test results and deployment orders that would prove beyond any doubt what was being planned. That information existed only in one place, the primary research facility where Silent Winter was being developed. Someone would need to infiltrate that facility, access the secured data systems, and retrieve the complete record. It was a mission deep into Velcrin space, to a heavily guarded military installation with almost no chance of success. Kale volunteered immediately. He knew the facility, knew the security protocols, and knew which officers there might be sympathetic to his cause. He could get in, or at least he had a better chance than any human infiltrator. But it was still a suicide mission. Even if he succeeded in retrieving the data, even if he managed to get the information to the resistance faction within the Velcrin military, he would almost certainly be captured and executed as a traitor. His own people would show him no mercy for what he had done. The military leadership considered Kale's proposal with skepticism. Trusting a defector was one thing. Sending him back into enemy territory with the hope that he would not simply return to his own people was another. How could they be sure this was not an elaborate deception? A way for Kale to return home with valuable intelligence about Earth's defenses and capabilities. Even if he was sincere, the odds of success were minimal. They would be risking resources and personnel on what amounted to a desperate gamble. Then Daniel did something that shocked everyone in the room. He volunteered to go with Kale. His reasoning was tactical, he said, keeping his voice level and professional. Kale would need backup. Someone who could operate human technology and provide combat support. Someone who could verify that the mission was completed and that the data was real. But his real reasons went deeper than tactics. Daniel believed in what Kale was trying to do. He believed that peace was worth fighting for, that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, and that sometimes you had to trust people even when every rational argument said you should not. Commander Blake's response was immediate and negative. Daniel was a patrol officer, not a special operations soldier. He had no training for deep infiltration missions, no experience with the kind of combat they would likely face. More importantly, Blake said, Daniel was emotionally compromised. He had formed some kind of bond with the Velcrin prisoner, and that clouded his judgment. Sending him on this mission would be irresponsible at best and disastrous at worst. Daniel listened to the objections and acknowledged their validity. Then he said he was volunteering anyway, and if they refused him, he would resign his commission and find another way to help. The debate raged for days. Military analysts ran probability simulations and concluded that the mission had less than a 15% chance of success. Intelligence officers interviewed Cale repeatedly, trying to find holes in his story or signs of deception. Psychologists evaluated both Cale and Daniel, trying to determine if they were mentally fit for such a high-stakes operation. Through it all, Cale remained adamant that he would attempt the mission with or without human support, and Daniel remained equally determined to go with him. Finally, authorization came from the very top of the command structure. The mission was approved, but with modifications. Daniel would not go alone. A small team of special operations soldiers would accompany them, men and women trained for exactly this kind of dangerous assignment. They would travel in a stealth ship, using experimental technology that might or might not fool Velcrin sensors. They would have limited backup and no hope of rescue if things went wrong. It was still a desperate gamble, but it was the best option available in a situation with no good choices. The team assembled quickly. 6 humans, each selected for specific skills, and 1 Velcrin defector. There was Carlos, a weapons specialist who could turn anything into an explosive. There was Kim, a pilot who could fly through asteroid fields blindfolded. There was Greg, a computer expert who spoke 4 languages and could hack most security systems. There was Rachel, a medic with steady hands and nerves of steel. There was Paul, a demolitions expert with a dark sense of humor. And there was Daniel, a patrol officer with a K-9 partner who somehow had become central to an operation that might determine the fate of billions. Atlas was coming too. Daniel had insisted on it, and surprisingly, Cale had supported the request. The Velcrin said that Atlas had been present for every important moment of this situation, and it felt right that the dog should see it through to the end. The military psychologists thought this was absurd, but they were overruled. Atlas was listed as mission support, and that was the end of the discussion. The stealth ship carrying the team departed from a classified military facility on a moonless night. The vessel was called the Shadow Runner, and it represented the cutting edge of human spacecraft technology. Its hull was coated with materials that absorbed sensor sweeps, and its engines produced a minimal energy signature. It was not truly invisible. Nothing could be in the vast emptiness of space, but it was as close as human engineering could manage. The journey to Velcrin space would take 2 weeks. Plenty of time for the team to review their plans and for doubts to creep in. Daniel spent much of the voyage with Cale, learning everything he could about Velcrin culture and military protocols. The language was complex, with subtle variations in tone that changed meaning entirely. The social customs were even more complicated, built around concepts of honor and hierarchy that felt alien to human thinking, but Daniel absorbed it all, knowing that his life and the lives of his team might depend on understanding these details. Atlas accompanied them to these sessions, and Cale seemed to take comfort in the dog's presence during difficult moments. The team drilled constantly, running through simulations of the infiltration. Greg had built a virtual model of the research facility based on Cale's descriptions, and they practiced moving through it until every turn and corridor was memorized. Carlos prepared the weapons and equipment, adapting human technology to work with Velcrin systems. Kim studied the patrol patterns of Velcrin security forces and plotted approach vectors that would minimize their exposure. Everyone knew their role, and everyone understood that success depended on perfect execution. The research facility was located on a moon orbiting a gas giant in the outer reaches of Velcrin-controlled space. It was deliberately isolated, both for security and because the work being done there was considered too dangerous to conduct near populated worlds. The facility employed over 300 Velcrin personnel, most of them scientists and technicians, with a security force of about 50 soldiers. Those were not good odds for a team of 8, even with surprise on their side. Their only advantage was that no one would expect an attack. The Velcrin believed their security was impenetrable. The Shadow Runner approached the moon using a slow, patient trajectory that took advantage of the sensor blind spots Kale had identified. They came in behind the gas giant, using its massive electromagnetic field to mask their presence, and descended toward the surface in what Kim called a controlled fall. The ship touched down in a rocky canyon 20 miles from the facility, hidden from direct observation. They would cover the remaining distance on foot, moving at night when the moon's harsh surface conditions limited the effectiveness of thermal scanners. The march to the facility was grueling. The moon's gravity was lighter than Earth's, but the terrain was treacherous, all jagged rocks and unstable surfaces. They moved in single file, Kale in the lead because he knew where the surveillance systems were positioned. Twice they had to hide in crevices while Velcrin patrols passed overhead in aircraft, and once they nearly stumbled into an automated sensor post that Kale had not known existed. Atlas proved invaluable, his senses detecting dangers before the human equipment could register them. They reached the facility's outer perimeter as the moon's brief night was ending. The complex was built into the side of a mountain, a fortress of metal and stone designed to withstand both attack and the moon's environmental extremes. Guards were visible on the walls, and automated defense systems tracked the approaches. Breaking in through the front was impossible, but Kale led them to a maintenance access tunnel he had used during his time working there. The entrance was secured, but Greg's equipment cracked the lock in under 3 minutes. They were inside. The interior of the facility was cold and sterile, all metal corridors and harsh lighting. Kale led them through service passages, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they would be spotted immediately. They encountered a patrol at one junction, 4 Velcrin soldiers who had no chance to raise an alarm before the team neutralized them. It was not killing if it could be avoided, but it was efficient and silent. The bodies were hidden in a storage closet, buying them precious time before the alarm was raised. The data vault was located in the heart of the facility, protected by multiple security layers. Greg worked on the electronic systems while Carlos set charges on the physical locks. Kale provided access codes that were still valid, though he warned that his clearance might have been revoked when he fled. Time seemed to stretch as they worked, every second feeling like an hour. Atlas stood guard, his ears alert for the sound of approaching footsteps. Then the vault opened and they were in. The data systems inside were advanced even by human standards. Greg connected his equipment and began the download while Daniel and the others established a defensive perimeter. The facility's alarms had not been triggered yet, but it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the missing guards or detected their presence. The download was taking too long, and everyone in the room could feel the tension building. Then, with agonizing slowness, the progress bar reached completion. They had everything: the complete documentation of Silent Winter, including test results and deployment schedules. The alarm sounded as they were making their escape. The harsh wail echoed through the corridors and emergency lights began flashing. Velcrin security forces converged on their position, cutting off the route they had used to enter. The team fought their way through, using superior tactics and human stubbornness against larger numbers. Carlos's explosives created chaos and blocked pursuit routes. Kim's piloting skills, adapted to running on foot, kept them moving through the maze of corridors. Rachel treated injuries on the run, keeping everyone functional despite accumulating wounds. Daniel found himself fighting beside Kale, covering each other's backs as they had practiced. A Velcrin soldier raised a weapon toward Daniel, and Kale shot his own countryman without hesitation. Later, Daniel returned the favor, pulling Kale out of the line of fire when a grenade exploded nearby. The bond between them, forged in the snow of Alaska, and strengthened through weeks of preparation, held firm under fire. They were no longer human and Velcrin, officer and defector. They were soldiers fighting for the same cause. They reached the maintenance tunnel and piled through, Greg sealing it behind them with a security override that would buy them minutes at most. The run back to the Shadowrunner was desperate. All stealth abandoned in favor of speed. Velcrin aircraft pursued them, weapons fire lighting up the night. Paul stayed behind to use his demolitions expertise, setting charges that brought down part of the canyon wall and blocked the pursuit. He died doing it, buying his team the time they needed to reach the ship. Kim got them off the moon and into space, the Shadowrunner's engines screaming as she pushed them beyond their design limits. Velcrin warships detected them and gave chase, and for a terrifying hour it was unclear if they would escape. Then they crossed into neutral space, and the Velcrin ships broke off. unwilling to risk an incident with the other species whose territories bordered the area. They had made it barely, and at a cost that would haunt them all. The data they retrieved was everything Kale had promised and more. The evidence was undeniable and horrifying. Test results showed Silent Winter killing human subjects in ways that violated every galactic convention on warfare. Deployment schedules targeted the largest human colonies for the initial release. Names of high-ranking Velcrin officers appeared throughout the documents, implicating them in crimes against sapient beings. It was a complete record of planned genocide, and it would shake both nations to their foundations. Kale transmitted the data not just to human authorities, but to his contacts within the Velcrin resistance, officers who had been waiting for proof to act on their convictions. The revelation triggered a military coup within the Velcrin Empire. The officers responsible for Silent Winter were arrested by their own people, many of them killed in fighting between loyalist and resistance forces. The Velcrin High Command, faced with internal rebellion and the threat of galactic intervention, had no choice but to sue for peace. The weapon program was dismantled, the research destroyed, and the officers involved put on trial. For humanity, the mission became the stuff of legends. The story spread across all human colonies, growing in the telling but remaining true in its essentials. Officer Daniel Cooper, a simple patrol officer, had found an enemy soldier buried in the snow and chosen mercy over duty. That choice had led to the exposure of a genocidal plot and the prevention of a war that could have exterminated humanity. Daniel was awarded the Star of Valor, humanity's highest honor, in a ceremony attended by leaders from every major nation. He accepted it with quiet dignity, but he made sure to mention every member of his team, especially Paul, who had given his life so others could live. Kale was granted political asylum and eventually became an ambassador, working to build bridges between Velcrin and humanity. It was difficult work, as many on both sides resented him for what he had done. Velcrin saw him as a traitor who had betrayed his own species, while some humans could never forget that he was one of the people who had developed Silent Winter in the first place.